Hello everybody and welcome to a new episode of Crafting with Cosplay Fabrics. My name is Indra and today I'm going to show you part 2 of sewing bias tape. So in this episode I'm going to be showing you the different ways that you can sew, how to sew some corners, and some tips and tricks on how I do this for cosplay. Let's get to it. Here I have the double fold and the single folds as I explained in part 1. So typically with a single fold you can use it to where you just top stitch it, which I think it's very common. I think it's pretty like standard. But another way that bias tape is sewn is you cover the edges. So usually for something like a single fold, you can just cover the edge and then you can pin it and sew it. But I want to show you another method, and you can do this with a single fold, but it is typically better if you do this with the double fold. And this is where the wide, if it's extra wide, it comes in handy. So the first thing that you want to do is open your bias tape on one side, and you will need pins for this. And what you want to do is line this up with the edge and go ahead and pin that into place. So once you have this, right, you want to then sew on this line as close to it as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. So I got my machine set up and I'm only going to be using a straight stitch. My stitch right now is at a 3.5, but you can choose something to your preference, of course. And really quick, the reason why I do this method, and you'll see once we're done, is this is a really nice way of getting a really even and really, I guess, invisible seam, like making this as invisible as possible. Whereas if you just cover the edge, let's say like this, and sew right above it, you're going to see that stitch line, right? Which is totally fine, and it might be the effect that you're going for. But you'll see how this looks, and this is as nice as possible. So I got my machine set up. Let's go ahead and sew this. So all I'm going to be doing is just doing that straight stitch right on this line. Okay, got that sewn, so I'm going to go ahead and cut the little threads off just to better show you. So, this point, if you have any threads from your fabric, you can clip some of those. You do want to do that beforehand, but if you see that you got some fraying happening because you were sewing, you can go ahead and clip those now. So as you see, we have that sewn, right? So the next step is going to be to cover that edge. So go ahead and start flipping this over. Okay. And you can see how you don't see that seam, right? So now you can do what is called stitch in the ditch, meaning you sew right here, right on that seam right there. And sometimes when you look at bias tape, the best way to do that, to do this method, is sometimes you'll notice that when you fold it in half, there's going to be one side longer than the other. So whichever side is the longest is the one that you want to have on the back. I hope that made sense. That way when you cover your edge completely, then that is going to, this side is going to be longer to where you can actually catch that side through this stitch here. If you think that it's too bulky, if this is too bulky and you realize that then, for example, let's say that it's too bulky and when you wrap it, it ends up becoming shorter, what you want to do then is shave as much of this as possible, so you can actually go ahead and cut some of this off. I'll do that to show you. I'll just clip this over here. And because it's already sewn and this already has a fold, you don't need to like pull, like pull it even more. Just keep everything as is, and then you pin. And it really helps at this stage to iron everything. Keep this as flat as possible. Okay. So same thing as before, straight stitch, but what we're gonna do is run the stitch right here. You can also do the stitch right on the edge if you're unsure if it will catch. So your preference, but I will show you how this is done. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and place my needle right at that. What would be the ditch? And even I like tried to sew it as straight as possible. Got some little like hiccups here, but you can tell that if you can get that as straight as possible, even that looks pretty clean. See, and that is the back side. You can also sew, like I mentioned before, not on what would be the ditch, but right on the very edge. Why that looks better is because if you just say, you just sandwich this, if you sew here, you still have that little lip from the bias tape. This gives you like a completely smooth finish. I'll show you the difference so you can see the two different versions. So here is the version where all I did was just wrap the bias tape around and just sewed it right on top. So you can see the difference between the two. This still looks really beautiful. It's a really nice finish, especially if you can get a really nice even stitch. If you can get it as close to the edges as possible, and it can actually look nice. But you can see that there's two ways to do this depending on how you want this to look. I personally like this method, and I use this a lot for other things. Another thing that you can do if you find that this is very difficult to do is that you open, so let's say let's say you sewed it here, you sewed this here like I explained before, you did that, right? And let's say you got to the point where you're wrapping it back here, you can open this to create a sort of like a Hong Kong stitch instead, and this gives you a lot more room to sew, so then you don't have to bother stitching right on the ditch, but you can sew a little bit further away from the edge of that bias shape, so you can sew a little bit more like here, which can make an even further invisible look, especially if you can match the thread perfectly to your base fabric. So there are some other options for you. So now that we have these down, let's talk about sewing edges with bias tape. Alright, so when we are doing edges, there are two ways of doing this. I'm going to show you, if you are sort of just like tucking this in, then you can do just if you're sandwiching the edges without doing basically you're doing this method, then when you're doing a corner, what you can do is just you flip this, so you take this edge, or I should say like this, like the remaining side, and you want to sort of like fold it over to the edge, right? So you're going to then match that center, so the center line right here, right? This center line, you want to match that with this. So we were right here, we're bringing that around over here and matching that line. You just kind of flatten it, so you'll be with something kind of like that looks like this. And then you fold this over, and then you have a really pretty edge right there, and then you sew. One thing to keep in mind is that this edge, you want this corner right here to match up with this edge over here, because sometimes when you do this, if you fold it over, this part right here can come out a little bit more, and you're gonna end up with an edge like this. That doesn't look as nice, so make sure that that's tucked in and that you have a really nice angle, and all you do is just sew that edge, and make sure that the same is for the other side. And that's a very easy method of doing that. Another way that you can do edges is if you do the stitch in the ditch. So the way that we do this is we're gonna sew right like I explained before, right here, right? But because we're doing this edge over here, what we want to do is sew, we're gonna stop and sew like towards the edge. A really easy way to do this is like when you're sewing and you're getting close to the edge, just stop a little bit and kind of fold this, right? Just so you have an idea of like where to sew. So we're just gonna kind of mark that down. That way you have like a little fold, and that way you know to sew like about that much, right? So go ahead and sew this line, and then out here. Okay, let's do that. So when you get to this point, to where you're gonna sew that edge out, what you want to do, let me bring this down a little bit so you can see, is you're going to leave your needle down, but you're going to raise your presser foot, right? And then you're just gonna turn this to that angle that you want to sew. Put your presser foot down and just keep sewing. Make sure that's good. When you're done with that, should look something like this. So we have sewn right there. Okay, once we are over here and we've sewn this, then you want to take this piece, right, and fold it over to that, I guess, angle, right? And you can kind of fix it so you can get a better angle, right? So it looks a little bit straighter. So once you have that, you folded it up, hold it, and then bring this down and fold it so that this matches up with the edge right there. See? So let's do that again. So this we sewed, pull this up, straighten it out so that it looks like a nice edge, and then we fold this and match this, whatever this, see? We just basically roll it to where it matches that edge. Okay? And then we just keep sewing right there. Same as before. Can see, just sewing right on that line. Okay, so we are left with this weird thing, right? So what you want to do is just kind of flip this over, right? And you're gonna be left with that really pretty edge at the front. And then in the back, what you can do is just, here, let me show you, is just do that same tucking the edges like I showed you before. Just, there you go. Doesn't have to be anything fancy, but there you go. That is a super easy way to do a mitered edge with bias tape. And you're gonna end up with really pretty edge. And then you just continue sewing, like stitch in the ditch. I didn't sew all the way here, that's why it looks weird. But you can either do stitch in the ditch or sewing like this. Same thing, same thing. So there you go. That is your easy way for doing bias tape. And a big thing here is pressing everything. Like ironing everything out will make things look way nicer. So here we go. And that's it. I hope that this helps you figure out how to do bias tape, how to use it. I will show you in the future other ways to do bias tape, how to use it, how to do edges for cosplay. We've been getting a lot of requests on how to do some of the gold edges that I showed before, so I will do that as well. So please stay tuned. I do hope that you enjoyed this tutorial. Hope you found it helpful. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you soon for another tip, trick, or tutorial featuring cosplay fabrics. Bye-bye.